This story begins one snowy and cold evening. A carriage was driving along the top of a mountain, heading somewhere far away. But then, suddenly, due to the heavy speed and ice on the road, it hit a rock, and because of this, everyone inside was shaken violently. A little girl who was riding in a carriage and had pink hair suddenly hit her head on the edge because of this stone. The mistress who accompanied her immediately came up to the girl and began to ask if she was all right, for the blow was quite serious. However, she was fine. Right now, this little girl was on her way to her fiancé. And even though the journey was taking about a month, she was still going to put an end to it. The bouffant dress, the lace gloves, and even the people treating her like an honored person, it was all very foreign to the girl. And it's because she's completely unaccustomed to this kind of attention from others. A father who abandoned the family very early on, and a brother whose world simply collapsed after her father left, causing her to become addicted to alcohol. That was the kind of family the poor girl lived in a place where no one cared about her at all. However, even if things worked out that way for the girl, she still thought she should be grateful for all that she had. At least they didn't abandon her like those around her. Time passed, and the girl grew up, and the mother, who desperately wanted to die all this time, did die one day. The girl, who had already become quite an adult, had no time to be sad for her mother. She had to go on with her life, solving the problems that were left behind. In order to somehow distract from the harsh reality, the girl found for herself a very good novel, which was called If You Get the Main Character. He was a ray of hope in her endlessly difficult life. It was only in those moments when she read that she could truly feel alive and meaningful in the world. The protagonist, who has been in grief, and the protagonist, who has been in love with him all his life, connect their fates after all. It was certainly one of the most popular yet formulaic novels in which everything ends with a happy ending, no matter what problems haunt the protagonists. As in all novels, they went through all the sorrows and hardships that met on their way together, and the sudden death of the main character's parents, as well as a marriage of convenience that was for the purpose of procreation. The protagonist named Acerus had an outstanding talent, thanks to which he was quickly able to get the position of archmage. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for his fictitious wife, April. Her body couldn't accept magic. She had a disease that made her body weaken when approaching or coming into contact with magic. No one had ever been able to discover the cause of her resentment. Many different experts were called to the castle, but it was all to no avail. April, who was pregnant, was eventually unable to resist her illness and died with her baby during childbirth. After losing his entire family in an instant, Acerus meets the novel's protagonist, Andrea. Of course, this lady was no ordinary lady. She could control Acerus's magic power. There was no love at first sight. However, they didn't have to wait long either. A little time passed, and soon they fell in love with each other. In fact, everything the girl had read up to this point was the simplest plot that was very common. However, for some reason, all the people disliked April and were always belittling her. The problem was that April, who was dead and innocent, was always being compared to Andrea for some reason. The girl seriously couldn't understand why they were all humiliating her so much, and what April had done that they hated her so much. From the beginning to the end of her life, existing only for the sake of developing the storyline of the main character, poor April, and the angel who received love and recognition from everyone, Princess Andrea, the girl did not understand how these two opposites could even be compared to each other. April was the kind of person who was clearly disliked. That's what made the girl love her, because they were so much alike. However, she always felt bad for being so miserable, innocent of anything. Poor April had ended her part in the story so quickly she had just been used, and after that, she became unwanted by anyone. And one day, thinking about this story for the umpteenth time, the girl suddenly fell asleep. When she opened her eyes, she was already being led to the carriage. She couldn't understand or control anything. The girl was in shock because she woke up in the body of the very same April. She didn't even know it was possible. And so she was put into a carriage, and the girl went straight to her husband. She couldn't do anything, so she just had to cower. In fact, she couldn't even believe that she had been so obsessed with the story that she had gotten right into it. However, the girl who had found herself in April's body was very happy that she at least remembered the story well. At that moment, she reached into her purse, pulling out a small notebook, for she was determined to write everything down in detail. After all, who knows? Maybe something would happen and she would forget everything. April's past wasn't really revealed much in the novel. There was only a brief mention of her in Acerus's childhood. The girl began to write down everything she knows in a notebook and set goals for herself for this life, because there is no other way. And her first task is to comfort Acerus, who has lost his parents. After that, on the first night, they will have to sleep in separate rooms. No loving intimacy shall be allowed. After that, the girl will have to find the great sage who can awaken the magic of Acerus. Then she made a note of the fact that Ostel Manor was a rather harsh place. And April's body is very weak, so it will definitely be necessary to keep an eye on her health. The girl thought about the fact that this was the kind of place where even lords died, and she was already doubting if she could even survive there. However, she wrote it down for herself in her notebook anyway. The last item on her plan of action was to make friends with Acerus himself. When everything was finished, the girl carefully began to read through all the points of the plan, wondering if she had forgotten anything else important. But then April slammed her notebook shut and sighed heavily, still trying to figure out how she'd gotten herself into this predicament. I mean, she doesn't even know what April's character was like before the action of the novel began, and neither does Acerus. They were engaged before the children were even born. Therefore, they had absolutely no choice at all. The girl looked out the window at that moment. She really hoped that no one would realize that she wasn't the real April, seeing the same completely changed everything. There was almost nothing to be seen outside the window. However, only the white snowflakes that were falling to the ground were visible. The girl realized that still, no matter how it was, and no matter what happened, the most important thing for her was to remember a very important thing. She must never ever under any circumstances allow Acerus to have a child. And the girl, thinking about it, was very serious because more than one life depended on it. Quite some time had passed since she had started her journey, and soon, with the onset of morning, she did arrive at Ostel's mansion. As soon as the girl looked out the window, she recognized it at once, for there was a flag on the very top, and she remembered the emblem well. The barren lands of Ostel, which are very hard to miss. On the way to the castle, by then the girl had already grabbed her suitcase, preparing to get out of the wagon. In fact, it was a place that once thrived. However, years later it turned into what it is. The frost curse is to blame. Long ago, the lands of Ostel were cursed, and the curse itself was imposed by a great sage, who eventually fell under his own curse and soon died. And in the meantime, a princess was born. It was she who soon helped break the curse of the great sage. And that same Ostel shone with new colors that the people had not seen in a long time. When the golden ray of light fell, it was as warm as the sun, and it was all thanks to her. The frozen ground began to recover, and the frost soon disappeared altogether, a finale in which everyone was happy. It was also the finale where the girl who found herself in April's body is dead. At this point, the girl started to get out of the carriage and thought that after all, whatever it was, she had a goal of returning to her home world. That's why she's going to use her trump card. When she got out of the carriage, her attendant maid told her mistress that she looked incredibly beautiful. She went straight to the castle to go inside. However, there were already servants lined up to greet her, bowing at the same time. The girl still couldn't really get used to it. She felt so uncomfortable about it that she couldn't even look the servants in the face and see their heavy looks. But soon, as she began to walk toward the entrance, she saw the door begin to open. April was immediately excited. She thought it was the main character finally showing up. And when the guy opened the doors completely and stepped outside, the girl suddenly stopped. She couldn't believe what she saw in front of her. April suddenly began to have some strange feelings inside. She couldn't understand what was happening. Her hands suddenly began to tremble with excitement. At this point, the guy came closer to her and turned and asked if she had come to him for comfort. He smiled at her and told her he was very happy to see her. April was already at this point just standing there and looking at him intently. She still couldn't believe what was really happening. The guy suddenly started hugging her in greeting, and in fact, he was happy to see April, and she couldn't even move. Her body felt like it was frozen. Soon he released her, and April could smell the strong scent of chrysanthemums. The guy also sensed this fragrance. Then he suddenly smiled and looked carefully at his wife. April was already at this point clenching her hand into a fist to make it stop shaking. The guy looked into her empty eyes, in which there was not a drop of hope. Then he held out his hand and told her to come with him. April was very surprised. She looked at him so surprised that it was embarrassing. Before long, however, she coughed and gave him her hand in return after all. It was all very strange to her. She didn't understand why she couldn't move at that moment. It was as if her body had stopped obeying her, and she just couldn't control it. By then, the servants had already gone inside and taken their workstations. However, when the boy and girl were walking down the corridors, they suddenly looked at them like that, even with terror in their eyes. And as she walked by, suddenly noticing this, she didn't understand why everyone was so scared. Then, an elderly man suddenly walked out to them before the meeting. He greeted Mrs. April and said his name was Odin. The girl looked at him and was surprised. She thought he looked a lot like a butler. When April smiled happily and told Mr. Odin that she was very pleased to meet him, the man, hearing this, suddenly became very worried. He looked at the girl with such misunderstanding. She thought at this point that she had probably said something wrong, and apparently she should have addressed him in a less respectful and businesslike tone. April turned to Acerus, moving closer to him, and said she was a little cold. The boy then suggested that she come inside. After that, they went inside the manor, where it was much warmer. However, all this time, and in front of me, some strange feeling was letting go. Even though she thought everyone seemed kind of happy to see her, she felt a strange coldness that she couldn't quite figure out who it was coming from. They were walking through the castle, and the girl suggested that it could probably be because of the death of Acerus's parents. However, the girl still decided that she should not pay much attention to it. She had more important things to do and bigger problems to solve. Soon they came to one of the rooms, which looked simply luxurious. It was all pink and quite bright. The guy looked at April as they walked into the room and smiled and said that this was her room now. The girl looked around and was shocked. She didn't understand why this room was so strange and why everything was pink. However, she then decided that it was not the most important thing at the moment. So April turned to Acerus, who was standing behind her. The girl thanked him for walking her to her room and wanted to say something about his parents. She didn't have time, however, because he interrupted her and said that he was actually suddenly very curious. The guy walked closer to her and asked April why she was suddenly calling him Acerus. The girl, hearing this, suddenly became anxious. She didn't understand why he was asking such strange questions, so she asked him what he was talking about. The guy looked at her again and said she was in this place because of his parents. Acerus suddenly became very serious and angry. He said, grimacing, that she was very disgusting to him, and that she dared not enter his room under any circumstances. April was very surprised. She didn't understand her fiancé's reaction, and she couldn't understand what he was talking about. However, at this point, he suddenly laughed and said that he didn't really like her at all. And then, turning to leave, he said that he was just keeping her in the loop. For April, the news was like a stone dropped on her head. She hadn't expected her relationship with Acerus to go so badly. But then Acerus suddenly waved at her smiling happily, saying goodnight. And in a whisper, he told her not to even dare remind him of her presence in any way. After that, the guy slammed the doors hard and happily went to his room, and April was left alone with her thoughts. She couldn't believe that even in this world there were idiots who could talk like that. The girl couldn't believe this was happening. She was going to have to live in this creepy pink room. Then she looked at the beds. She couldn't believe that she would actually have to sleep there. To her, It was worse than hard labor. There were many different soft toys on the bed, and it was too luxurious in general. Then the girl came closer to take a closer look, and suddenly saw some strange toy in the shape of a man, and directly started scrutinizing it and couldn't believe that it was really a toy in the form of Acerus. The girl thought about the fact that April must have had to go through a lot of obstacles she didn't even realize she had. Apparently, she was really in love with Acerus after all. She suddenly felt very sorry for her and led her to die without feeling any mutual love, only hatred and coldness in her direction. April grabbed that toy harder and started throwing it at the wall, thinking about how she'd never be able to put up with his lousy temper anyway. She looked at the toy that lay at the other end of the room. She thought that if he ever dared to be rude to her again, as he had been this day, she would guarantee him the same flight as that doll. With that, April turned around and was about to explore the room, but then suddenly she heard a knock on the door and immediately allowed entry. The girl was surprised and asked who was there. At that moment, the door opened and a maid entered the room. She said hello and said that she was the head maid and her name was Rel. The maid asked if Mistress April remembered her. At this point was in shock. She couldn't believe that she had been standing outside the door all this time and maybe even heard the conversations. She was silent for a while, and then, seeing Rel's shyness, she said that of course she could pass. Then she suddenly heard some shouting outside the door. It was the other servants. They were very surprised that the mistress had allowed the maid to enter. April was very worried. She hoped she hadn't done something weird that a real heroine wouldn't do. Then Rel spoke to her and said that her mistress had said she was ugly and forbade her to enter her room. The girl objected and said that it was not so at all. She couldn't actually believe that the real April was really like that and could do that to a maid. She took Rel by the hand and started to pull her into the room, telling her to come in because it was very cold outside. The maid stopped at this point and looked at April and told her mistress that apparently she had really grown up since their last meeting. However, when she saw mistress's face, she immediately apologized. I don't know what it came over her and why she started saying such words. April, who felt uncomfortable about the situation herself, said that it was really no big deal and decided it would be best to just change the subject. The maid told the lady in a sad voice that her late uncle would have been very glad to see her. April was very surprised by this. She remembered that when she had read the story, only one sentence had been allotted for their story of death, and being on the other side of it, she hadn't felt it. However, now that she was part of the story, a strange feeling never left her. Then she told the maid that if it was true, she missed them too. The girl pulled out her handkerchief, which was decorated with embroidery, and thought that Acerus must be feeling even more sadness for her parents. And even though it wasn't revealed in the story, it was probably true. April handed this handkerchief to the maid and firmly said that from now on, she would be a completely different person. The girl was very serious and also said that in the future she would never allow the maid to cry. She had just promised that, and Rel couldn't hold back her tears anymore and cried even harder. The maid couldn't believe that the girl was really saying such words. April smiled back at her, and then the older maid ran over and started hugging her tightly. At this point, the girl gave in to the embrace and really hoped she had done the right thing after all. After their conversation, some time passed, and the maid finally calmed down and stopped crying. However, her eyes were very swollen. Rel apologized to her mistress and said that she shouldn't have behaved like that. However, April replied that she was fine, although all of her clothes were soaked, so the girl had to change. Afterward, she told the maid that she had a request for her. However, it might seem strange to her. However, April asks if the maid could tell her what she used to be like. She thought it would help her realize her mistakes, because she had promised to change. Rel was very happy about such a request and clapped her hands, saying that of course she would always be happy to help mistress. The girl was also enthusiastic and seriously said that she was willing to listen to anything just to change for the better. Well, then the maid suddenly became sad and said that after she told her all this, she might be thrown out for insulting her majesty. April laughed nervously and said that there was nothing she could do about it. She couldn't even imagine what the girl could have done that she couldn't even tell. When she turned to Rel and said that the maid must be very tired for the day so she could go and rest for a while, the maid wanted to stay. However, she still agreed and left. The day passed quickly enough. Soon it became dark outside the window, and many different stars appeared in the sky. April sat up on the bed. Her eyes were already closing due to the fact that she was very tired. Still, however, she was still able to learn a lot of new things during this day. But she wasn't sure if she would be able to keep up with it. April looked up at the moon, which was engulfed in clouds, and sighed heavily as she went back to her room. The girl thought that she should tidy up her notebook after all. But she lay down on the bed and covered herself with a warm blanket and decided to do it the next day. 20 minutes before, when Acerus had left his mistress's room, he had gone straight to his room, where a warm fire was burning that warmed the entire room. The guy remembered saying he didn't like the girl, and after that he left. He thought that would be more than enough. Of course, it was a bit rude to April. However, he just had to do it. Acerus sat at his desk and thought about everything. He was actually very tired from the day because he had heard many different sounds, and even now when he seemed to be sitting alone in the room, he could still hear them. It was too noisy for him. It was because his hearing could pick up even the footsteps of animals outside the mansion. In fact, every knight strong enough could have such an ability. However, the guy was very much annoyed by it. He could never be alone and just sit in silence. All the time he heard various sounds. He's also annoyed with April for going too far with her love for him, and there's nothing he can do about it. He probably wouldn't want to be so rude to her. However, she is overstepping her bounds. He'd asked her to stay out of the way, by the way, when he heard some strange sounds again, like birds singing. Suddenly, however, everything went quiet. The boy was very surprised. He didn't understand why it suddenly became quieter. Acerus suddenly thought that something had probably happened to her, because she wouldn't just shut up. In fact, if it weren't for the death of his parents, he never would have married her. But the guy just couldn't call off the engagement. Marriage was necessary in order to inherit the throne. Acerus has decided that he can't let his relatives hide everything his parents have accomplished. So he needs to deal with it, even if only alone. He must. He would just have to do it. Otherwise, all the effort and the death of his parents was just in vain. However, Acerus couldn't think of what to do with the girl. He assumed that he could just ignore her. Well then, suddenly, he heard very vivid words from April, who said she missed them too, and would be different from now on. The boy even stood up from his chair out of surprise. He had no way of knowing what it was all about because the girl simply couldn't say such words. Acerus thought he might have just heard it, and when he decided to return to his thoughts, it happened again. He heard April tell the maid that she wouldn't let you cry anymore. And then, the guy heard her say that her maid must be tired, so she could go and rest. He didn't even have anything to say to something like that. He hadn't expected April to say that. Acerus suggested that perhaps he had imagined it. He realized, however, that he certainly couldn't have imagined it 3 times in a row. He couldn't believe it was really April's words. The boy suddenly thought that there was no way he could let himself be fooled. All the people he had encountered since that day were deceitful and disgusting, and it made him realize the whole nature of people. He believes that all people are self-serving and hypocritical, and that they find their own benefits everywhere and don't think about the people around them. So he decided that he would never fall into April's net. After that, he went to bed as much as he could, considering he had heard everything. When morning came, April started filling out her notebook as soon as she woke up. She spent a good deal of time on it, but soon finished. The girl thought that it would be enough. She wrote down a lot of important and very useful information there. Then suddenly the girl's ear itched. She assumed that it must be Acerus talking about her. After that, there was a sudden knock on the door. The mistress immediately said that whoever knocked could enter. At that moment, a maid came running into the room. She wished good morning, mistress. She looked quite young, but that did not prevent her from working as a maid. April smiled as she looked at Sina and said her name was Sina and she would see to her comfort. April immediately asked where the maid who had accompanied her on the way to the castle was. Sina immediately replied that she had gone back, and the girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She could not believe that the maid would really spend all this time alone on the road. However, at this moment, she suddenly thought about it and looked at Sina and decided that instead of the maid she already knew, it would be much more convenient to get along with the one she was seeing for the first time in her life. April smiled then and asked the maid's name again, saying she could take care of her. The maid immediately glowed with joy. She couldn't believe that her new mistress would be so polite and sweet. Sina walked over to her and started looking at her hair, then said she would dress her up so that everyone in the manor would be shocked by her beauty. The maid smiled and said that the gentleman must have been waiting for her already, as it was their first breakfast together. April, hearing those words, was very surprised. She couldn't believe that Acerus could be expecting her at all, especially after the words he had said to her last night as soon as she arrived. Then the girl remembered that the real heroine liked to dress up, and she thinks that this trait of April's was what annoyed Acerus. So April turned to the maid and asked her to make her something simple and not too flashy. The maid was very surprised to hear this because it was unnatural for a mistress like the girl, but she obeyed and did her bidding anyway. When everything was ready, April went to the banquet hall where breakfast was to be held. The maid followed her, escorting her. Before she entered the room, however, she saw a man at the entrance. April immediately recognized it as her father. She thought he was probably the estate manager. However, when the girl took a closer look at him, she didn't understand why he was suddenly so sad. And indeed, he was not cheerful. April looked around and realized that this setting reminded her of her job interview at the company. She moved closer to him and smiled happily to dispel the awfulness of the situation. She said good morning and added that she would get dressed. The man looked at her in surprise. He didn't understand why she was suddenly talking like that, but he said hello too. At that moment, met his gaze. Then the girl thought about it. She decided that this was a kind of interview, and she would be able to cope because she had already gone through it more than once. The girl decided to show what her interviewer expects from a long time ago, because a certain type of worker is hunted. Then April suddenly turned to the man in a serious tone and said that he didn't like her after all. But then she softened and said he could go on and on, it didn't bother her one bit, because her goal was to be loyal to her family. The girl bowed and said that she wasn't really the April that was rude and stupid anymore. She had actually changed already, and she thought that's what they would need help from him for. She needed to make her position clear to him. April looked him straight in the eye and said, smiling, that she was going to be a worthy mistress of this estate. Odin looked at her incredulously and afterward bowed back and said that he actually believed her. The girl was immediately happy when she heard those words. She had finally succeeded in realizing what she wanted so much. She went further and thought that even though he still didn't call her mistress, however, there was already progress. April is definitely going to get her way. She just needs a little time and a little more patience to realize everything she wants. Soon the girl entered the dining room, and as soon as she crossed its threshold, she immediately heard a man's voice asking scornfully, "Has she really come?" Immediately she looked in the direction that the voice had come from, and saw that Acerus was sitting there, looking at her intently. The guy actually had a rather menacing look, and he himself at this moment thought that the girl had finally arrived. However, it was certainly not on the cheerful side. April smiled at him and wished him good morning, as if she had no idea that deep down he hated her very much. When the girl looked at him and decided that Acerus must have heard her conversation with Odin, yet he still continues to look at her as an enemy, by then April had already sat down at the table to start breakfast. While they were being served food, the girl glimpsed at her spouse and decided that he must really appreciate his appearance. However, there was no denying that he was indeed handsome, one could not argue with that. At that moment, Acerus suddenly turned towards the girl and saw that she was looking straight at him, and it lasted for a few seconds. As soon as April realized she had been exposed, she immediately turned away from him. She realized that she was probably just staring at him too long and hard. Suddenly he spoke and asked her in an arrogant tone if she was satisfied now. Then, as if nervous, he started tapping the table with his finger. April didn't know what he was talking about. However, when she looked directly into his eyes, she saw the hateful look there. The guy suddenly started to get up from the table and asked if she remembered saying he should smile at the sight of her. Acerus moved closer to her and took her hand while telling her that if he didn't do what she wanted, the girl would tell his mom everything. He knelt in front of April and asked if she knew why he kept smiling at the sight of her, even though his mom was no longer alive. April looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand what was going on. She couldn't even move and just sat there in the same position. She couldn't even move her hand, though she wanted to. Acerus looked her straight in the eyes, and after that, he kissed her palm gently and said, while saying that it was all because she could solve his problem, which was related to the title. The girl realized at that moment that she had completely lost control of this body. She's doing whatever it wants to do. The girl must have realized that this was April's own reaction to what was happening. After all, she was sitting there smiling nervously the whole time, still holding his hand. The girl couldn't change her posture or even stop smiling. Acerus continued to kiss her hand and said that her mere existence was already enough and she might as well not even bother doing anything. The girl at this point thought that of course she could understand his actions, which were aimed at protecting the estate. But at this point she was really angry and didn't understand how he even dared to say something that she should just stand idly by. She couldn't believe what he was trying to say, that everything she had said to Auden was just nonsense. Plus, he dares to say it in front of everyone. Acerus stepped away from the girl at this point, already sitting down in his seat, as he suddenly heard April say that he meant that she was just a tool. When he heard those words, he slapped his hand on the table and asked what she was saying. Apparently they had hit him hard. However, she also smiled as she looked at him and told him to just tell it like it was and not beat around the bush. She continued to eat her food and said that she knew he, after all, had another purpose. In fact, in Ostel, for centuries, the throne has been passed down exclusively to women, and the reason for this is to break the curse placed on the city. That, of course, is only possible if there is a family. That's what Acerus is trying to do now. Break the curse. April replied in a calm voice that she knew a way to break the curse that had been placed on Ostel. The boy was very angry when he heard that, and asked how she knew about it. The girl, bringing another piece of meat to her mouth, thought that she couldn't tell him she'd read about it in a novel, could she? So she would have to think of something else. She was silent for a while. Then she said that she had overheard the adults talking about it. They said that when they became adults, there would be someone among them who would break the spell. But Acerus didn't take it seriously. He sighed heavily and said it was all nonsense. The girl thought at that moment that if she were in his place, she wouldn't believe her words either. However, the most important thing was that everything she said was really true. They were silent for a while. Then the guy turned around and said that even if it was true, it seemed like she was just trying to get his attention. April laughed and said that she had completely forgotten to tell him one very important thing. Then she looked her husband straight in the face and suggested that if someone came along that they fell in love with, it would be easier to divorce. Acerus, who was about to leave at that moment when he heard these words, stopped and looked at the girl in surprise. He could not believe that she was really proposing such a thing. He was silent for a while and sat back down in his seat, then asked if she was even joking now. April looked serious and replied that she wasn't kidding, so she hoped he wasn't making plans for an heir. Then she glimpsed at him to see what the guy's reaction was. She hoped he understood what she was talking about, but when April saw the look on his face, she was very surprised. She couldn't understand what was wrong with him. Acerus was very confused at her suggestion and couldn't even look the girl in the eye. He asked in a quiet voice if it was too early to think about a receiver, and April was very surprised at his reaction. He almost cried, and then the girl realized that I guess I should have mentioned it for now. They continued their meal in silence, and the girl decided that next time she would be more careful about what she said. After that, April went back to her room. She was immediately greeted by Sina, who hugged her and told her that she had been really cool. The girl had not expected such a gesture from the maid, but she hugged her back and laughed nervously, asking if she really thought so. But suddenly a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. April immediately looked to the side and saw the given man walk into the room. He said hello and asked if she could come into the living room. There were some inheritance matters that needed to be resolved. The maid, as soon as she saw an intruder enter, immediately moved away from the girl. Sina turned to her mistress and said with tears in her eyes that the mere mention of Odin was already making her scared. April didn't say anything, but thought about the fact that she was actually kind of uncomfortable having him around too. After that, the girl pushed those thoughts away from her. She thought she needed to pull herself together and be brave. However, it didn't turn out the way she expected. April turned to Odin in a quiet voice and was about to say something, but he was interrupted. The man said that these are actually the first steps to becoming a good hostess of this estate, and asked if they would be starting already. April simply had no way out, so she moved to a special office where, sitting at a desk, she began signing and studying various papers. It had been quite a few hours since she had started, and soon the girl had finally signed the last paper. Outside the window, however, the sun had already set, and the moon was beginning to rise. April signed various papers from morning till night, without a moment's rest. She felt like an office worker who was also working overtime. But soon April signed the last paper, and the house manager said that was the end of it for now. The girl was immediately glad when she heard that, realized that now she would be able to come and get some rest. Odin turned to her and said in a calm voice that the lady had changed a lot, as if a completely different person was now sitting in front of him. April was surprised. After all, he did call her mistress, just like she wanted. Soon the girl did all the evening procedures and finally came to her room and lay on the bed. She was very tired. Before she fell asleep, however, April thought about everything that had happened and realized that it had been worth it after all, because she had been able to get a confession from Odin. After this, the girl fell asleep at once. But the night passed as if in an instant, and she was awakened by the maid, who told her that the master wanted to see her. April, who was still dressed in her pajama dress, got out of bed and said she'd be right over. When she opened the door, she saw her husband on the doorstep. April was surprised and asked what had brought him to her at such an early hour. Acerus looked very serious. However, he didn't look the girl in the eye but simply said that they needed to discuss the wedding ceremony. April was suddenly embarrassed, for she had forgotten all about the formalities. Then she suddenly looked sternly at her husband and asked if he was going to discuss all this on the aisle. The girl stepped aside, allowing her husband forward, and smiling, asked if he was going to come in. And I thought to myself, he should stop being stubborn already. Life would be so much easier. It was soon time for Acerus to go in, and the girl threw a shawl over her shoulders to keep out the cold. In fact, in all the time she'd spent in this place, she'd realized that she was really disgusted with her husband. April smiled and told him not to worry. She wasn't going to touch him. The boy looked at her in surprise and asked if she was all right. The girl laughed nervously and replied that she was fine. She was just trying not to act like a child. In fact, she also realized that every time he touched her, she lost control of her body, and the moment he was about to touch her hand, she quickly yanked it away so he wouldn't. However, the girl didn't understand the reason why April's body was reacting to Acerus in such a way. He suddenly looked the girl straight in the eye and turned to her and apologized for what had happened the previous day. He suddenly ran his fingers through her braid and said that he had overdone it a bit. The girl was shocked by his actions. She even blushed because of the unexpectedness and awkwardness of the situation. And Acerus continued. He smiled and said that she did a great job with the paperwork, and the process was noticeably faster because of her. He kissed her braid and thanked her for everything. The girl couldn't move again. She felt her body stiffen again. He'd only touched a few strands of her hair. But at that moment, he let go of her hair and narcissistically said that, in fact, he could have handled everything himself. Then he took the book he had brought with him and gave it to the girl. He said it was a catalog. Whether to look at it or not would be her decision. After that, he picked up and quickly started to walk away as far away from the girl as he could. He was uncomfortable even just being near her. April laughed at that moment and thought that maybe he didn't hate her that much after all. After that, the girl returned to her bed. She held the book he'd given her, and she decided that she should look at it first, and then decide what to do. April started to open the book before she even saw what was in it. The girl was already sure that there was nothing beautiful in it. However, when she saw the first page, she was shocked. She didn't expect it to be so beautiful and chic. All of the clothes were sewn from high-quality materials, and each one was right in April's taste. Well, all of a sudden she took a closer look at them and wondered what she would do if they didn't look good on her. She still doesn't know what's best for April's character. Since she is not the protagonist of the novel, one should not place much high hopes on her appearance. That's exactly what the girl thought. Well then, she suddenly walked over to the mirror and began to scrutinize herself. The girl didn't expect it to be this bad. April saw that her heroine was just incredibly beautiful. She was much more colorful and memorable in person than in pictures. She has silky pink hair, eyes the color of early woods, porcelain skin, and lips like ripe cherries. She winked at herself in the mirror and thought that if beauty were illegal, she would be the main culprit. Then the girl turned back to the catalog and shouted excitedly that she would make sure April was an incredible beauty. At this time, Acerus had already returned to your office and began scrutinizing various documents. When given to him, told him that the girl would only have to sign the papers, he was fine with that. However, knowing April, she could easily mix things up and bankrupt the guy, which is why he decided to carefully double-check the paperwork for her. However, the document he took first was so well crafted that it makes you wonder if it was really April at all. He remembered the house manager asking that the Lord be a little kind to the lady, for after all, she had left her family to be at such a sad and difficult time for him. At that moment, he suddenly remembered how Acerus had taken to kissing her hair that morning. The smell made him feel a little sick. He immediately tried to push those thoughts away from him, for he felt too embarrassed to even just remember it. Actually, he just wanted to pet her and tell her she did a good job, just like they do with pets when they bring slippers. But he still couldn't understand why April was suddenly avoiding his touch. He thought she liked him very much. Acerus couldn't believe that she had just taken him and fallen out of love with him like that. But then suddenly he heard voices. It was April. She couldn't believe the beauty she saw in front of her. He laughed because of his musings and thought that even if that was really true, he didn't care at all. She was always walking around with that doll in her hands, and she was weird enough. It really annoyed him that every time she called him cute or pretty words while doing so, she couldn't even avert her gaze. Remembering this, he sighed heavily and thought about the fact that he was actually a strong and brutal man, and such tenderness hurt his dignity. Then all of a sudden he heard the girl shouting, turning to April and saying that she would make the girl an incredible beauty. Acerus, hearing this, was very surprised. He couldn't understand what it was. The boy couldn't believe that all this talk of beauty wasn't about him, and these thoughts made him terrified. Then he felt ashamed and went back to his bed and was ready to lie there all day. Another day had passed since then, and for the morning April went to breakfast as usual. In fact, she had picked out the most beautiful dress last night, which lifted even her spirits. However, when they were having breakfast, the girl didn't understand what was going on with the expression on her husband's face. Why was he so unhappy? Well, then she just decided the best way was to just ignore him. And then, suddenly, Acerus turned to April, already wanting to say something. The girl at that moment thought he had spoken as soon as she thought of it. However, he didn't even turn to her and said nothing and let her forget about it. This made the girl very angry. However, she didn't show it and just smiled, pretending not to care. At that moment, Dana approached her and, smiling, told her mistress that she must be in a great mood. April confirmed his assumption. Acerus, hearing this, still didn't even turn around. He was too embarrassed to look her in the eye after his past thoughts, so he just sat silently. Then the guy suddenly got up from the table and said that he had some very important things to attend to right away, so he was leaving and apologized for that. April looked at him in surprise. However, she continued her meal. She didn't understand what was wrong with him, or if there was ever a day when he was in a good mood. Then her husband said that he had to solve the problems that had arisen on Mount Yotria. When she heard that, she choked up. In fact, this is the very place where Acerus first met the great sage, so she should definitely be there with him. April stood up and said that she would really like to go to Yotria too. But the manager suddenly looked at her gravely and said that under no circumstances should that be done. The head maid, who was clearing the dishes from the table, came over to them and agreed with the manager. She told her mistress that she could not go there, for the place was infested with cannibal monsters. April was very surprised, and upon hearing this, however, she became saddened and said she understood. She realized that apparently the sea monsters hadn't come to the surface yet. She needed to find them before they did. But at that moment, something strange suddenly happened. April was about to continue eating her food, but suddenly she felt as if the table had moved. She looked away and then exhaled with relief, thinking that she had probably just imagined it after all. At that moment, some man suddenly ran into the banquet hall. He looked very worried and started shouting all the time, which was very dangerous. Acerus looked worriedly at the entrant and immediately inquired as to what had happened. A stranger in uniform began shouting and said that a message had been sent from the eastern shore. And it said that a huge monster had appeared. April was also very surprised when she heard that. Everyone immediately started making a fuss. The house manager went to deal with the man and decided to find out more about the message. April couldn't believe that the monsters were already starting to swim out. Suddenly, the alarmed head maid came running up and began to lead her away from the banquet hall. The girl was crushed. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Her legs were stiff, and she could barely walk down the corridors, and the maid kept pushing her along. Soon they stopped. The maid suddenly grabbed the lady by the arms and shook her, telling her to get ready, for he had to leave immediately. April thought at that moment that she was right after all. The girl should really come to her senses and be patient and strong. The girl thought about the fact that she was just as responsible for this castle as Acerus. She simply had to protect all her subjects. The girl immediately turned to them and told them all to hide under the table and be sure to keep their heads safe. All the maids and workers in the castle immediately started climbing under the tables. April said that if there wasn't enough room under the table, any other safe place would do. Suddenly, she heard her spouse speaking to her. The girl immediately turned in his direction. April immediately shouted to him to stay back, for it was too dangerous in this place, and as Acerus ran without stopping. He looked at her and shouted for her to run away, but she didn't know what he was talking about, and continued to stand still, looking at him in surprise. But at that moment, the girl suddenly heard some kind of squeak above her head. She immediately looked up to see what it was. However, as soon as she raised her head, she immediately felt a strong push. It was Acerus. He grabbed her and pulled her away from where the chandelier had fallen. The man purposely held her head with his hands so she wouldn't hurt it, but April meanwhile looked at what was happening behind her. He kept hugging her, and the girl didn't realize what was happening. She couldn't believe it was really happening. It was amazing to her that Acerus had actually saved her. Then she thanked him quietly for it. The guy started to let her go, and she said that luckily the earthquake had stopped, and she was no longer in any danger. His hands continued to hold her shoulders. He wasn't going to let her go. Acerus looked at the girl in surprise, and then suddenly began to scream. He wondered what thankfully meant, and how April could even say such a thing. His whole body shook with anger and fear. He moved closer to her and said that she should have taken care of herself first, not some servants. After all, she had almost died. How could April even think of saving with a bow when her life was in such danger? He grabbed her hand and told her to leave the place now. At that moment, the girl thought that she should never let him touch her again. So she smiled happily and looked her husband straight in the eye and said he was very handsome. Acerus was very surprised and asked what she was talking about. The girl said that when he was angry, he was even more beautiful, impossible to look away. Suddenly, she was silent, not sure what had gotten into her. She supposed it was probably something inside April talking again. Acerus, surprisingly, was not angry. He continued to hold her hand, and then, with a gentle voice, asked her to come closer. He also said that if she was scared, she could just hold his hand and now it was over. So she had nothing to worry about. April was shocked to hear him say that. She definitely didn't expect such a thing from him. At that moment, Acerus took off his cloak, which was very warm, and threw it over the girl's shoulders. He moved closer to her and said that he would protect her. His eyes showed sadness and courage at the same time. It was then that April realized that the deep scent of chrysanthemums she'd been smelling all along was coming from him. From the man who'd been visiting her parents' grave since she'd arrived. It had been quite some time, and she still hated them. The girl averted her gaze and apologized. She said she had forgotten to visit his parents. Acerus looked at her carefully and said that it wasn't really the most important thing right now. Then he became more serious and asked her not to take her life so lightly anymore. After all, she should take better care of herself. After that, he said that all the servants would be punished. He doesn't understand how they all even dared to hide first without even taking care of her. Then, April suddenly laughed nervously and said that, in fact, she was the one who ordered them. However, the guy insisted and said that it didn't matter at all. They had to let her through first. It soon subsided and everyone went back to their workstations, bringing a cloak as it was too cold in the castle due to the windows falling out. The girl and the house manager went and inspected the damage. She thought it would take a long time for them to get everything back to the way it was. The maids took turns coming up to her and thanking the mistress heartily for helping them. The knight then bowed before her and said that next time he would be sure to protect her and not allow such a blunder again. In fact, since the day of the incident, the attitude towards April in that castle had completely changed. Of course, Acerus scolded all the servants heavily because they ran to hide and didn't even help Madame in the first place. The girl and the house manager continued to look around as another maid suddenly approached her. It was Sina. April immediately walked over to her and asked her in surprise, wondering if she had something to say. The girl looked very sad and kept looking away from her mistress. April had never seen her like this before. She asked that the maid tell her if she had something wrong, because she was starting to worry. Sina was very worried, so she clenched her hands into fists the whole time and said in a quiet voice that perhaps this was all even for the best. April asked her to speak plainly. Then the maid tearfully replied that apparently the wedding couldn't take place. The girl, hearing this, was horrified. She could not understand how this had happened. She was silent for a while, and then asked what it meant. Sina looked insanely sad. She explained to her mistress, however, that the earthquake was to blame for the earthquake, which had caused all the roads of Ostel to be blocked. That's the reason all the supply ships won't be able to make it. April now realized what she was talking about, and after that, she began to think of a solution to the problem. The girl said that first of all, while they are in isolation, they need to distribute all the food available so that they have enough. They would also need to send the documents to the capital to arrange the marriage. Sina was really surprised to hear this. She didn't expect Madame to suggest such a solution to the problem. In fact, April was going to keep doing all of this, for it was only when the marriage was approved and formalized that Acerus would be given the title of head of the estate. The girl went the other way and said that they urgently needed to analyze the extent of the damage. They couldn't delay. Sina ran after her mistress and asked if she was upset that she wasn't going to have a wedding ceremony like she had dreamed of all along. The girl turned and smiled, asking how on earth she could hold a ceremony and have fun when there were so many people around who needed their help. Sina stopped at this moment after hearing Madame's words. She assumed that she was probably really very concerned about the people around her. After all, even in a critical situation, she thought of her subjects first. At that moment, another maid came running to them and brought beautiful flowers. She gave them to April and said they were a gift from the Lord. The girl scrutinized them carefully. April noticed that this gift was flowers made of paper with jewelry in between. She was shocked at the gesture of attention. And then she moved the flowers closer, thinking that Acerus wasn't as stiff as she'd thought. The girl suggested that he probably thought that his wife, with whom she had not been able to have a wedding as planned, would receive such a comforting gift from her husband. April continued to look at the gift and thought she needed to think positively. After all, this occasion gave her time to choose a dress that was even more beautiful than the last one. Acerus himself at this point was also going around the castle and surveying the damage. In fact, there were more problems than he had realized. The hotel is cut off from the outside world as it is surrounded by the sea, and because of the monster, the whole country shook. At that moment, he suddenly thought of his wife. In fact, he was very sad that she was going through the same thing. The man thought that he'd rather April was thinking about various dresses and jewelry than global issues. In fact, the moment he saved her, he was very afraid of losing her as well as his parents, and didn't even notice the risks he was taking in saving her life. Acerus firmly decided to himself that he could no longer let the people around him disappear. He walked farther and farther into the castle, thinking about April, and came to the conclusion that apparently he didn't hate her now. He'd always thought people never changed. However, when he saw how the girl was trying to change, he also decided to change his opinion of her. After all, it is unfair to judge a person like that. It's been a while since then. April slept in her room because there was no damage. One morning she turned to the maid and asked if Acerus could not be present at breakfast this morning. But the maid, brushing her hair, replied that on that day the master had said he would come. April sighed and said that he must be very busy these days. However, the maid replied that mistress was helping him with a lot of things too. The girl, as mistress of the estate, had many problems to solve and as soon as possible. And certainly there was no way she could have handled all those duties without the help of Auden and Rel. One day a girl woke up and saw a present on her bed. When she opened the box, she saw a dress of incredible beauty. And that morning, remembering it, she decided she wanted to give some sort of gift to Acerus too, for that jeweled paper bouquet. So she prepared a special, though less expensive, gift for him in return. April had prepared 2 small rings, and knowing his picky nature, she really hoped he would like it. The girl really hoped that they would work as wedding rings, so she went to the maid and asked if she could just not give them to her. But Sina told the mistress not to even think about it. After all, she had made it with her own hands, thinking of the master, so she was sure he would definitely like it. That's when April made her final decision. She would do it after all. She went to the maid and asked her to prepare a dress for her. She wanted to wear it. Soon everything was done. April put on one of her last and most beautiful dresses and came to the banquet hall. As soon as the door opened, Acerus immediately looked in her direction and said, smiling, that she had come after all. However, as soon as he said this, the girl came into the room and the man was shocked at what he saw. April was dressed in a gorgeous dress. She was also given an equally beautiful hairstyle. The girl walked in and said hello, wishing him a good morning. And the girl giggled and said she felt like wearing the dress he'd given her. and then, twirling around, she asked if it looked good on her or not. Acerus suddenly became embarrassed. He looked away from the girl and said that it wasn't much, but it was still cute. He didn't really understand what was happening to him, or why April suddenly seemed beautiful to him. The girl had already walked over and sat down at the table next to him, looking at his face intently. April thought that the dress must really suit her, so much so that he even looked away. When the girl sat down next to him, he was ready, it seemed to her, to even run out of the room, and she didn't understand why he suddenly had such a reaction. They turned to each other at the same time and wanted to say something. April stopped at once and told him to speak first. Acerus didn't really like this situation, but he watched the girl for a while, and after that he turned away and spoke. The guy apologized for not giving her advance notice, and she was so prepared for this wedding. April was very surprised to hear that. She hadn't expected him to actually even think about it. However, the girl really was fine. She just wanted to thank him for the gift, that's all. Now she didn't know how to put it, so he'd understand exactly how she felt. April considered her options for a while, but her mind was blank, and she didn't even know where to start. Then the girl turned to Acerus and asked what he thought about talking in the fresh air. The guy smiled and said he would be all for it. Then the girl started to get up from the table and said that she would go and wait for him. Acerus smiled her goodbye and waved his head. As the girl walked out, he suddenly thought, Guy didn't understand why she suddenly didn't say anything about their wedding. In his mind, he assumed that if they didn't get married, she would decide to go back to her house. Acerus even choked on his drink, so realistic he had imagined it. He couldn't believe that she could really say that after all they'd been through. He couldn't believe that his apology wouldn't be enough to keep her in the castle. It wasn't up to him, after all. At that moment, the manager suddenly approached him and told the gentleman that he had to go now. The boy began to wipe his mouth of the leftovers and agreed with him. Soon, Acerus was walking through the corridors of the castle and pondering various topics. He wondered what the girl was talking about, since she couldn't discuss it at the table. After that, he thought to himself, not realizing what was wrong with him. Why was he so nervous? Soon he went outside and thought about what he needed to pack. Even though she had changed, she was still the same April. At that moment, the girl suddenly turned to him and smiled lightly, telling him that he had finally arrived. Acerus at this moment suddenly felt strange again. His ears suddenly began to blaze with red flames. He couldn't control his feelings, which wanted to come out. He was silent for a while, and then, taking his eyes off the girl, asked what it was she wanted to talk to him about. At that moment, the man realized that his mistake had been in thinking as if no one knew her as well as he did. But now he realized that he really didn't know anything about her at all. She was like a stranger, and now he would have to get to know April from a new side, because his feelings were so strong that it was hard for him to control them, let alone hide them from the girl.